All right, well, thank you everybody for tuning in to this really exciting joint event that the New England Aquarium is hosting along with OceanX and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. My name is Orla O'Brien. I'm an assistant scientist with the Anderson Cabot Center for Ocean Life at the New England Aquarium. I'm with the aerial survey team, and I'm going to be talking about our aerial surveys over the Marine National Monument. I'm going to pass over to Buck. Buck, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, everybody. You did really well, Orla, and I messed it up. Thank you. My name's Buck Taylor, and I'm the Submersible Operations Team Leader for OceanX. And I run global submersible operations on the Aleutian and our new ship, the Ocean Explorer 1. And I shall pass you on to Tim.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name's Tim Shank. I'm a deep sea biologist in the biology department at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. I've been here about 20 years, and I've been researching deep sea hydrothermal vents, hydrocarbon seeps, seamounts, canyons, trenches, basically wherever I can find deep water animals living on the bottom that are flourishing with great adaptations and evolutionary novelties. I thrive on that. So I'm happy to be here today to be able to present to you the deep water canyons off the coast of the United States. Welcome, everyone.
All right, so we all have a ton of stuff that we want to share with you guys, so I'm going to jump right in and not waste any time. I'm sharing my presentation here. So, like I said, I'm going to talk about the aerial sightings of marine megafauna in the Marine National Monument. So just to start out, for those of you that might not be familiar with the monument, the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument is an area that was designated for protection in 2016. It's about 5,000 square miles and includes 3 underwater canyons and 4 seamounts or underwater volcanoes. It's about 130 miles off the coast of Cape Cod, and it's the only marine national monument in the Atlantic, the North Atlantic, and near the continental US. Now, scientists from Mystic Aquarium as well as New England Aquarium were instrumental in designating the monument. And they chose this area because it includes a wide range of habitats and represents one of the best remaining examples of undisturbed ecosystems in the North Atlantic. So we only surveyed the canyons area of the monument because it takes us over an hour just to fly out to those. This is a track from one of our recent flights. Now, this flight was about 500 nautical miles and took over 6 hours to complete. So you're probably imagining us in some sort of luxury airliner, but we actually survey in this tiny plane. And this is me and another observer, Amy, in our flight suits before a survey. So why do we find so many animals here? Well, just like anyone else, animals like to go to where the food is, and the canyons are a great place to find squid specifically. So here you can see a common dolphin in the middle here, and it's chasing all of these pink things are little squid at the surface here. Now, besides squid, animals here also feed on krill, copepods, and small schooling fish. So I'm mostly going to talk about whales and dolphins, but let me start with some of the fish that we've seen. We see basking sharks and ocean sunfish, and these are animals that are common to New England. But we actually see some more unusual species as well. And this is a manta ray that we saw in the fall of 2018. Manta rays are filter feeders that eat mostly plankton. And I like that you can see the mandibles of the ray flared out as it actually swims around, eating with its mouth open in this photo. Now, just over a year later, we actually saw another type of oceanic ray, and this is a Chilean devil ray. What's fascinating about these fish is that they migrate very long distances and they can actually dive over a mile deep in search of their food. Both of these rays, as well as whale sharks, which we've seen in the monument as well, are usually thought of as warm water species, but clearly something's drawing them to this really unique area. So although we see some fish and sharks, mostly what we see are cetaceans, whales, and dolphins. An animal that we see really often is the common dolphin. They get their name from the fact that they can be found worldwide. We've seen them on most of our flights, and we often see them in really large groups. And this photo is a small part of a group of about 500 common dolphins that was spread out for miles in every direction. Common dolphins can be recognized by an hourglass shape that they have on their side and their long pointed beak. They're about 8 feet long, and they feed on schooling fish and, again, squid, which the monument has a lot of. Another type of dolphin we see is the bottlenose dolphin. Now, most of you are probably familiar with what are coastal bottlenose dolphins, the one you see off the beach in Florida, but these are offshore bottlenose dolphins. The offshore type are actually a lot larger than the coastal type. They can be 10 to 12 feet long, and they can weigh over 1,000 pounds. The offshore bottlenose dolphins live in small groups like this one, and they feed on schooling fish and squid, just like the common dolphin. A type of dolphin that you're probably not familiar with is the Risso's dolphin. So adult Risso's dolphins are a really light gray to white color. So when you first look at them, you might actually think they're beluga whales. Risso's dolphins can be found in waters from New England all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, but they really like deep water near the continental shelf edge, so you're not going to see them off the beach. Risso's dolphins are born gray, and they become brown as juveniles and then gradually lighten with age. And you can see a few of the darker colored calves here next to the adults. Part of the reason that they get lighter with age is that they accumulate scars on their bodies from a social tooth raking behavior. And this is a nice example of the color variation between individual Risso's dolphins here. So these dolphins are squid specialists, which makes the canyons a perfect habitat for them. They can grow to be 10 to 13 feet long and dive as deep as 1,500 feet to search for squid. Now that might seem like a deep dive, but that is nothing compared to beaked whales. Beaked whales are a group of animals that are all champion divers. A Cuvier's beaked whale, like the ones in this photo, has been recorded diving almost 10,000 feet, and they can hold their breath for over 2 hours. Beaked whales are, again, squid specialists, and something I kind of find funny is that they only have a couple teeth in their mouth, so they feed on squid by sucking them into their mouths. They're suction feeders. And if you notice a color difference between a couple of the whales here, it's actually because Cuvier's beaked whales get this encrusting diatom or brown algae on their back. Another species we've seen a lot is the Sowerby's beaked whale. And the best way to tell them apart from the Cuvier's beaked whale is by their longer flippers and their long, thin snout. So moving on to some of the bigger whales, sperm whales are right at home in the canyon, since you probably already know that they love to eat squid. They can dive up to 2,000 feet deep, and they hold their breath for up to 45 minutes. So really, whenever we see a sperm whale, we're pretty lucky, considering how much time they spend under the water. Now, all the marine mammals that I've talked about so far have been odontocetes, or toothed whales. And that means that, yes, they do have teeth, but something else that sets them apart is that they only have one blowhole or nostril on top of their head. So for sperm whales, that blowhole is always on the left side of their head, which you can see in this pair right here, this blowhole. And that means that they have a distinctive exhalation pattern. So whenever sperm whales breathe out, their blow is at a 45-degree angle to their body, which is a great way to ID them from far away or from a boat. So mostly we see odontocetes, but we do see some baleen whales as well. Baleen whales, or mysticetes, like this fin whale, don't have teeth. They have keratinous plates that they use to filter foods such as krill, copepods, and small bait fish. We've seen scattered baleen whales here and there, but a survey that we completed last February was really unexpectedly full of them. We saw a humpback, we saw some sei whales, and we saw many, many fin whales. Fin whales are the second largest animal in the world. They're about 70 feet long, and you can really get a sense of their size seeing this group of common dolphins bow riding in front of this fin whale here. They also have a unique asymmetric coloration. They have a bright white lower right jaw, which makes them really easy to identify in the field. But I want to end on one of our most thrilling sightings to date. So on this same February flight where we saw all of the fin whales, we actually saw 2 different blue whales. Blue whales are even larger than fin whales. They are the largest animal on the planet. They can be up to 100 feet long, although they generally don't get that large in the Atlantic. Seeing blue whales was exciting for a couple different reasons. The population in the Western North Atlantic is maybe only about 250 adults, so there really aren't that many of them. We know that these blue whales spend their summers in the Canadian Gulf of St. Lawrence, but their winter movements are not well known. And based on what we know about blue whales on the West Coast, our canyons could actually be a really great place for blue whales. And the canyons could provide a good environment for krill, which is blue whales' favorite food, to aggregate. Now, another reason that this blue whale sighting was so cool is that some of our Canadian colleagues were actually able to match one of these whales to a known individual. So we saw this same whale twice during the survey, once in the middle of the survey, the photo on the left, and again on our way home a few hours later, the photo on the right. And we were able to confirm that these 2 sightings were of the same animal because of this unique pattern of skin modeling on its back that you can see in both of these photos. So that got us wondering if anyone else would be able to recognize the whale. We sent the photos to Mingan Island Cetacean Study in Quebec, and they checked out our photos against their catalog, and they identified this whale as an adult female whale that's actually been spotted by several different research teams over the years in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the Gulf of Maine, and now in our Marine National Monument. And I think that story of cooperation is a really nice note to end on. So I want to leave you with one of my favorite views, which is Nantucket Island on the way home from a successful survey. And I do want to mention that I get to have this amazing job because of institutions like New England Aquarium and also institutions that fund these surveys, Natural Resource Defense Council, National Ocean Policy Coalition, and the Conservation Law Foundation. Now I'm going to leave you to dive underneath the water with Buck and Tim, but I will be back at the end to answer any questions that you have. Oops.
Thank you, Orla. And I am just going to screen share right now. So here we go. Okay. Hopefully you can see that. As I said, my name is Buck Taylor, and I run the Submersible operations. And we're part of OceanX, which is an ocean exploration initiative founded by the Dalio Foundation. We combine technology, science, and media to try and educate, inspire, and connect the world to the oceans. And by having the subs, cameras, and science equipment that we can load onto the submarines, I think we do a good job doing that. Now, during the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Charter, we were lucky enough to be teamed up with Tim Shank and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. For the trip, we were operating aboard the Aleutian, and we had 2 of our 1,000 meter or 3,300 feet rated subs on board. So they can actually dive 1 kilometer below the ocean. The sub team's made up of 4 people, and we're all pilots, but also engineers. There's a lot of work to do to keep the submersibles operating. Seawater and electronics is they're the best enemies, but it's a big part of our job. And you can see on the picture there, that's the back of the Aleutian, where you can see the A-frame, and that's our launch and recovery system. And so that basically holds the submersibles nice and tight while they're in the air, stops them swinging, and we can get them on and off the ship. Normal dive time is about 8 to 12 hours, and that's from leaving the surface to getting back to the surface again. And that's based on our life support. When we're inside, we're completely sealed off from the world. We have to provide oxygen, take away the CO2, and keep everybody alive. So that's a big part of our job. Another great thing about the man subs are they're free swimming. It means that there's no umbilical, no lines, no tethers on the submersibles or between the submersibles and the ships. So all of our communications and tracking, it's all done acoustically. So we send messages through the water, and the ship knows exactly where we are and can follow us around. So the subs, there's a picture there. They can accommodate 3 people, and we obviously have a pilot in there, and normally have a scientist and a camera operator. The pressure hulls are made up of acrylic, which is 7 inches thick. So very, very thick acrylic, and that withstands the ocean pressure as it's trying to squeeze in at 1 kilometer. And as you can see from this little video clip, it gives the occupants of the submersible a great view, both on the surface and when we get down to the bottom, wherever we're working. So a good 360-degree view of all of the action. So if you think of the sub as a platform, an elevator, and it's a way of taking the people and equipment down into the ocean. And for this charter, we had both media equipment and science equipment. So we had, for the media, we had 2 cameras on board. They're called red weapons. One was a macro and one was fitted with a wide angle. So we could get nice tight shots of all the corals and the critters that we saw down there. They film 8K, so the resolution is absolutely amazing. And to give you an idea of how much data we use every dive, each camera we're bringing back about 1 terabyte of film every single dive per camera. So that's 2 terabytes every time we go in the water. So it keeps, everybody on the surface busy. And those cameras are fitted with pan and tilt units so that the camera operator can point the camera from inside the sub remotely to capture the action. And on top of that, we have, because it's below about 200 meters, 600 feet, it gets pretty dark pretty quickly. We have 4 28,000 lumen LED lights, which lights up the action. And then for the science equipment, we had the manipulator arm, which you can see moving away there. And it's a robotic arm basically, but whatever the pilot or the scientist does inside, the arm outside does. So it's a great way to interact with species outside and be able to take samples of corals and sponges. And then on top of that, we had a suction sampler. If you think of it like an underwater vacuum cleaner that we can pick up things from the seabed. And then biosampler. If you see, this is the front of the sub over here on the right-hand picture. The 2 gray tubes are sample tubes. So we can use the manipulator to take the lids off, take coral samples or rock samples, pop them in and put the lids on. And then the one next to it, the white one here, we call it the pineapple sampler just because of its shape. And we have lots of individual samplers that we can take the lid off and pop samples in. So constantly through the dive, the scientists will be picking up samples and we log where they go so that when we come back to the surface, we know what is where, and we can log it depending on its depth and its location. So, an optimist or a pessimist? I consider myself an optimist. However, there were a couple of things about this charter that worried me, and they worried me a lot. Here's one, and there's a little clip from Wikipedia. Hurricane season. And if you read that, the highlight of hurricane season off the eastern seaboard is September. And guess when this charter was? Middle of September. So that was one. I was thinking, goodness, this is going to be a real tough charter. And I blame Tim Shanks for choosing the date. I'm not sure who planned it, but he gets the blame. But you can see here, submarines and rough weather don't mix very well. So I've been diving professionally for over 30 years now, and I've had my fair share of getting beaten up by Mother Nature. And trust me, it's not fun. Even though the ship is quite big, we still, as you can see, move around quite a lot. And if you hear the sub team call out "woo woo," it doesn't mean they're excited. It means we're waiting on weather. So that's a bad thing. We can end up waiting days and days and days for a calm period where we can launch. And I had this in my vision. I was thinking, this is a crazy charter. The other thing we've got to consider, if we launch, we've got to be able to recover the subs. So launch and recovery is the most dangerous part of any operation, because you've got a very delicate sub which can bash into the back end of the ship, which is very hard. If we are in the water and we have to wait on recovery because of bad weather, we can actually wait 4 days. So that's 3 people for 4 days in that little tiny sphere. And trust me, we never planned for that, because it would probably be the most miserable thing ever. I think the longest I've spent in a sub that small is 22 hours, and that was plenty long enough, I can assure you. What did we end up with? That is an actual picture of the area over the dive site. I think Tim must have been praying to the weather gods, and the weather for the whole charter pretty much remained like this. Here's a little time lapse of one of the recoveries, and you can see the swimmer jumping in and out and collecting lines, and it looks a little bit lumpy, but it's well within our operational limits. And that was about as rough as it got. And considering we were where we were in the middle of hurricane season, we were just so lucky. Next reason I was a little bit pessimistic. Now you can tell from my accent I'm not American, but I've been to New York plenty of times, and I've looked into the Hudson, and these dives were relatively close to some very populated areas. And although OceanX's head office is in New York, as far as I was concerned, it wasn't a great place for world-class diving. So I was expecting trash on the seabed, bad visibility, coupled with these big storms that I'd got in my head. And I was almost writing off the dives before they started. But then we started seeing some good information. And I wish I'd had Orla's presentation prior to leaving, because that may have calmed me down on this respect. On the bottom of the ship, we have an instrument called an ADCP, an acoustic Doppler current profiler. And that shows us water currents at different depths in the water. And when we were in the area, straight away, we could see that there were upwellings, so water movement coming up the cliffs, and downwellings moving all over the place. And that's a really good sign. Normally in areas like that, where you've got steep cliffs and high currents, it's generally a good place to dive. And then Tim started pulling out some of the multi-beam charts of the area. And you can see here, it's a very small scale, but the amount of canyons in this area is amazing. So I started getting a little bit more optimistic, looking at the huge canyons, gullies, and seamounts. Normally, steep cliffs not only mean dramatic topography, but also good biodiversity. If you've got a gentle slope with sediment on it, it's normally moving. So any corals or sponges, they've got nothing to attach themselves to. So you find huge areas that are dead. But when it gets to hard substrate like rocks and cliffs, all of a sudden you come across these little oases of life. And we started to get a little bit excited. There's my team, cameraman, a cowboy and a scientist. Again, not a bad team to be with. They kept me entertained all the way. To 1,000 meters or 3,300 feet, takes an hour to get there in the sub and an hour to come back. So straight away, if you're going to 1,000 meters, that's 2 hours of your dive to go. As Orla said, squid. We had a few visitors on the way down. Squid love the sub's lights, and you can see the squid, they come right up to the sphere and they look at you and they really do check you out. And we saw a few squid on the way down, so I was getting happier. And when we finally made it to the seabed, we started to see a little bit of life, a little bit of topography. You can see Tim there looking out in front of the sub. You can see, you know, how great the visibility is. Starting to see a few corals and sponges. And then using the sonar, on the front of the sub, we have a sonar, and it basically sends acoustic signals out. And depending on how quickly they return, we can actually build up a picture. So sat in the sub, we can scan around and look at different areas. We can find outcrops of rock, nice sheer cliffs. And we just worked our way around the different areas until we started finding more and more life. You can see in this picture here, these are the two camera monitors. The bottom one, we're filming a coral there in macro, and then the top one is just an overall picture. So that's how we build a story. We get a great overview, and then once we've got that vista, we go in tight and we get all the action. You can see here is at top of a ridge, and although underwater at this sort of depth, we only have at best 150 to 200 feet visibility, you get a very small snapshot of these huge canyons. You could definitely tell we were in and amongst some colossal canyons. These things are huge, and I'll let Tim explain how big they are in a minute. It's just, they're vast. This is one of my favorite pictures from that charter. If you didn't know, you would think that was taken on a shallow coral reef in some tropical paradise, and it's not. It's within 250 miles of New York City, and it's absolutely stunning. There is just so much life there. Here's a nice close-up. You can see the little crabs feeding on top of the corals. But one of the best parts of my job is being able to dive with world-class scientists and documentary makers. And yes, I am very spoiled, and I'm sorry about that. But in this regard, these series of dives were amazing. And they allowed me a front row seat into an area I had no idea existed, and I'm sure none of you knew existed. And seeing it there in such a pristine condition, it's one that needs to be shown to the world and protected. Unfortunately, all too soon, it was the end of a great charter. And you can see this little snapshot there. That is actually the sub ascending. And I get questioned about these pictures all the time because people look at the bubbles and they're like, the bubbles are going down. The sub's on ascent. We try to follow the speed of the smallest bubbles, about a pea-sized bubble. But here we're just going a little bit faster. That's why the bubbles are just slowly going down. But that's us on our way up. And when we finally got to the surface, Tim's prayers were still working, and the weather gods, thankfully, were still being kind to us. It was a relatively short charter, but we still managed over 5 days to conduct 6 dives. Maximum depth was 900 meters down into the canyons, and we had over 28 hours in water, and amazingly, no downtime due to weather, which still blows my mind when you look at the area and the time of year. Now you see Tim sat here giving a presentation to the crew of the Aleutian, and we often get presentations from scientists and documentary makers, and so we're completely spoiled. Unfortunately, that can mean we can be a tough audience, but not for this one though. So it's time to pass you on to one of the most captivating, entertaining, and knowledgeable scientists who's giggling in the background I've ever had the pleasure of diving with, and someone who can explain all the technical things about what we witnessed. So, ladies and gentlemen, Tim Shank.
Wow, Buck, that was quite the presentation, and thank you so much. It was a short cruise, as you mentioned, but it was fantastic. One of my best. I've been so fortunate since I started diving with, well, in 1993, with the Alvin Submersible here at Woods Hole. You know, this has these viewports that may be 8 to 12. The new one has 16-inch viewports, I think. So you get this view, you have your face pressed up to the side of the submarine, and you got one eye looking out, and you're thrilled to be there, and it's fantastic. It's been a great workhorse for us, you know, working deep. But to be in that acrylic sphere for the first time 2 years ago, there's never been an experience like that. You literally feel, folks, like you're in the water. There were fish swimming by, and I could have sworn, I mean, large fish, they were inside the submarine. You start to lose the perception where the acrylic starts and stops. And many times I would just point to something and I'd hit the acrylic because I didn't even know it was there. And so if you ever get a chance to be a part of that, I mean, Buck, you are so fortunate to be able to dive in those things and so frequently and see all the things you have. It was a privilege, sir, to dive with you and be a part of that mission. I could talk forever about that. So, and happy to answer questions about that. But I want to talk about the canyons and stay focused on the deep sea biology in these canyons and the marine monument included. I'll show some results of the cruise that Buck just talked about. But I really want to give you an overview of what these canyons are like. It's really important to understand. And one of the first things that hit me when we started, it was only 9 years ago that we started thinking about these canyons. They weren't mapped yet. No one had really explored them yet. We had been working in the Gulf of Mexico with the oil spill and the impact on corals. And so we thought there may be corals up in the Northeast, actually, in these canyons that we think are there. And so anyway, NOAA and a bunch of other folks and other agencies mapped these canyons over a 2-year period. And I put together this animation to give you a sense of how close the deep sea is to us off the coast of the United States. It's unbelievable. I'm going to show you. There's Long Island and Cape Cod, and we're going to move around Cape Cod in a second, so you get a sense of the terrain here. I'm going to show you the topography. So here's what it looks like underneath Cape Cod and Stellwagen Bank as we go over, and we're going to go over the continental shelf here, and then the slope, and abruptly it falls off. 20,000 years ago, sea level was much lower, and rivers that came off of North America came right across the shelf and carved these canyons in. There's more than 90 canyons from Canada all the way down to North Carolina. Look, they're massive. They go from 300 to 400 meters, or 1,200 feet, down to more than 9,000 feet. It's really unbelievable. There's seamounts out there that we also use, as Orla showed so well, the monument and described it, but they're the seamounts that are in the monument and also outside the monument. Here you see so close. It's a 2-hour drive from Manhattan to get to these canyons, and they give us access and a window into the deep sea that we don't get like this. It's simply amazing. And the point I really want to make too, and I'm going to have about 5 or 6 of them, and I'm going to just say I've got a point to make. The point I got to make here is that everything you see here in colored down to the dark blue is the United States. It's America. It's our underwater America. And people little know that the area of the underwater America that we have is 1.5 times the size of the continental United States. So what we have underwater is larger than the U.S. It's amazing, but it's so little explored, and yet it's our resources, it's our natural heritage, it's the cure for diseases. It's so much, right? I could go on and on about it, but I really want to make that point that this is your land, and we're here to try to explore it and understand it. And so, again, Orla showed the monument, the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts Marine National Monument, very well. It does have 3 major canyons in it, 2 minor canyons in it or so, but it's a very small area. I want to get that point across to you too. Just the canyons unit is really small. It's smaller than Connecticut, but it's extremely valuable, and that's one of the main points I want to get across today. And so I'm going to take you. The next image is going to be inside that box of the canyons, and I'm going to show you the topography of the seafloor. And it was great to see Buck's images and have him explain that these have these outcrops, these massive slopes and walls and buttresses. It's not all easy to see them from the submarine because of the light limitations, but when you get this kind of map, you can really see it. You could, on the side here, it's in meters from 400 down to over almost 2,900 meters. But if you see these little dark ticks inside the red on the scale bar, that's the Washington Monument, each one of those. So you can see I've got 3 stacked on top of each other to show you just what the red part means. And the green part is where we dove with Buck submarines, where it's green and yellow. That's 1,000 meters. And so you can see how these things, they're bigger than the Grand Canyon. The majority of these 90 canyons along our coast are bigger than the Grand Canyon. I could fit the Grand Canyon inside Oceanographic Canyon here on the left. So you can see the 3 main canyons there, that sort of cut into the red part or cut into the shelf, and those are super important. Okay, next message. What's really making all this happen, the reason why that Orla can talk about all the cetaceans and mammals and whatnot that are on the surface waters in their deep diving, is because of the currents that are here. The currents, the counter current comes along the U.S. from right to left in this image. It comes around the green part and the blue part, and it hits this topographic chaos that the canyons present. It hits these walls, hits these steep slopes, and it starts to circulate and eddy, and it lifts carbon off the seafloor. It lifts organic material off the seafloor up into the water column. In conjunction with that, right, so you have a lot of stuff in the water column now. In conjunction with that, you have the largest migration on Earth every day. The plankton go from the red part of this image down to the green, into the blue, up and down every day. And fish and crabs follow that migration, and other things do too. I think even the cetaceans do that. And so there's a massive sort of biological pump system that's going on. It's very dynamic. These are not just rocky structures that sit there and animals live in them. These are places that are breathing life. These canyons are amazing. Sometimes the walls even slough off. They crack and break, and they mass waste is what we call it. So all the rocks fall down. So you have lots of boulders, lots of topography for animals to live on. And so I want to give you the sense of the massive productivity that's there, that's focused in these canyons, which makes them really special and important. When you go down and look, Buck showed you some images. Here's another one. It's a promontory here, sticks out in the middle of the canyon. This is the kind of terrain you normally see. It's rocky, little sediment there because of those currents come by and take the sediment away. And what you get are these beautiful deep sea corals, a variety of species. So far along the canyons in the New England area, we found more than 75 coral species, all different types. Here's another image of a steep wall here. You're looking right into the wall. These are called bubblegum corals. They're massive fans. They're just amazing with lots of animals living on them. And I'll talk a bit about that in a second. So there are these gardens and forests here. If I take you down with some video, because I think video often portrays it much better than just still images for the 3-dimensionality of it. But here's a promontory with more than 6 corals on it. Fan corals, hard corals, little cup corals, sticking out off the rock. And they do that so they can get out into the current. They're not like shallow water corals. Here's some shaped like mushrooms. They're not like shallow water corals that have these photosynthetic algae in them. They don't need sunlight. They need passive organic material that's in the water column floating by. And they have these polyps on their branches. The branches are covered with polyps that have tentacles on them. And there's tentacles grab particles out of the water. And you see the water's kind of murky here. And this is a bubblegum coral. All the polyps are pulled in, but you see these shrimp living on it. Such dynamic ecosystems. Here's a hakefish living around this little garden of bubblegum coral. But I'll show you in a second. You'll see there's these polyps. Usually they have 8 tentacles and a mouth in the center, and they grab particles out of the water column. And so they really need that current to survive. They need that flow to continue. And they form these massive gardens, if not forests, of life that are just really unbelievable. I think there's a close-up coming up now showing you those polyps. There you go. You can see them waving in the current, and the shrimp eating bacteria off of them. And so next message, deep sea corals are fantastic. They're diverse. We don't fully understand their ecology and how they really work. We know they love these habitats of hard bottom, like Buck mentioned. They want to be out there to get the food. We also know they're very slow growing, microns per year. I'll talk about that. We also don't see them colonize areas. We rarely see, if ever, juveniles of corals that are scattered on the bottom that will become the next generation. So if we have an issue with a lot of corals being hit with a trawl or something like that, denuding an area, the likelihood of them coming back and sort of reforesting the place is not very high. They host a lot of diverse animal communities. I'm going to talk about that. There's well over 3,000 species that live on deep water corals around the world. I can't give you a number in the monument yet. I can't give you a number in the Northeast Canyons yet. We haven't done enough surveying. There's at least 100. I could say that. But given that they're slow growing, they're slow to colonize, they're very vulnerable to fisheries activities and mining, oil and gas extraction. They're threatened by ocean acidification and climate change. And I'll mention that in a few minutes. I want to give you just some really nice pictures of what these corals look like. There's 3 major types of corals. There's a hard coral like this one, where the skeleton is on the outside and the fleshy material is on the inside. And the polyp comes out, right, from that stony or hard coral skeleton. There's some crabs living on it that like to live on that kind of coral. Here's a soft coral, the second type. You can see now the tentacles, the 8 tentacles, if you count them, with the densely white colored material here. That's the mouth area. You can see the branches. Those branches are covered in a small layer of skin. So they have the tissue on the outside, and they have the skeleton on the inside. So they're soft corals. And then you have something called black corals. And you're probably saying, wait a minute, Tim, that's not black, that's orange. You can't fool me. And you're right, I can't. It is orange. And black corals can be white. They can be pink and red and yellow, probably even green somewhere. But if you look at the base of this coral where it's attached to the seafloor, it's actually black. And the black coral refers to the black skeleton. And that skeleton is really valued for the jewelry industry, for example, in the Western Pacific. Anyway, so I'm showing you this coral. It's about 4 feet tall off the coast of Hawaii and about 500 meters depth. And this is a special coral because one of the first that got dated for its age. And I told you it's slow growing. I told you it's microns per year. But if you were in an audience in front of me, I would say, how old do you think this is? I would say, you think it's 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years? Could it possibly be 2,000 years? Well, radiocarbon dating has shown this is over 4,000 years old. It's the longest living animal in the ocean that we know of. And so deep water corals, even the ones I showed you in that video, could be hundreds of years old. It's simply amazing. And that makes them even more vulnerable, doesn't it? And what makes them also vulnerable is they have different animals that live on them, highly diverse. And what I mean by vulnerable there is that if we lose the coral species, we lose the animals living on them, because this is a key slide to show you another message. I'm showing you 3 corals here, species, from right to left. There's the one on the far right, it's kind of a fan. You see a white one, a hard coral on the bottom, and a yellow coral with all the polyps pulled in in the middle left. Each one of those coral species is different, and they each have a different brittle star living on them, different species. And this is what we find time and time again, that there's a specific type of animals that live on certain species of corals. It's like they've co-evolved this relationship for this species to live on this species. and they come to know each other and evolve. It's like seeing bluebirds only in oak trees, right? And for some reason, other birds don't go on that oak tree, right? And we don't know why that is. And there's countless examples of this. Here's a brittle star and an anemone on a soft coral. If Buck were to collect that coral sample like that, those animals would stay on there. And that brittle star is so tightly wrapped on that coral. It's been there probably for months, if not years. It's like rigor mortis. I'd have to peel off the arms off the branch. And you can see that anemone there. It's also known to be only on soft coral, deep water coral. And you can see the polyps are gone along that branch. Somehow we think these anemones ingest those polyps from the backside. Not sure yet really how it does that. Another example, here's another type of brittle star. Different species of hard coral. It's a beautiful thing, a beautiful specimen here. We keep documenting these patterns of sort of uniqueness or specificity, we call it, from one animal living with another one. And how they come to do it, we really don't know how it's happened. We have a certain type of crab that spends its whole life on a soft coral. It's adapted to be amongst the branches of that coral. It has hooks on the ends of its arms that fit so nicely. And depending on the species of crab, it has different kinds of hooks that fit so well into that certain kind of coral it lives on. It's simply astounding in terms of evolutionary biology. They've come to have this ecology. I have so many examples, and I want to show you all of them. But here's another example. It's kind of a fuzzy picture because that crab on the right is only about the size of a nickel. And so that little thing lives on that bottle brush coral. It's a black coral. And these things are spread out very far away. Somehow this crab finds that very coral species, just that one. And when we find that coral, it usually has not one crab, but two. And it's usually a male and a female. And every once in a while, we find a juvenile on it, like it's a family unit. So somehow these crabs release their eggs in the water column. They somehow settle and find these corals, and they establish a family, it looks like. It's simply ridiculous. Here's a Dr. Seuss soft coral kind of thing. It's a spiralis coral that has crabs living on different apartment levels of this thing. It's simply amazing. These corals are fantastically diverse in their morphology. The animals living on them are simply fantastic. I love this example. Here's corals serve as nurseries for a lot of animals like cat sharks, and fish lay their eggs in the corals. And this is amazing. We found this a couple of years ago. This is what we think is an octopus egg. The octopus lays its egg, attaches it to a coral. And we found in the Atlantic near the canyons is that a certain species of octopus, this Dumbo octopus, it swims with its fins, attaches itself to a certain species of coral, just one egg on one coral. And we think that it's in that, it develops in that egg for about 9 or 10 months, if not longer. And then when it hatches out like it did on board the ship, we collected this and it hatched in a bucket when I was watching it. And this thing is fully formed, ready to live. It has a large yolk area that it can survive on for months before it has to start feeding itself. But we never knew the life cycle of a deep sea octopus before we discovered this. And what's amazing is not just that animals live specifically on certain kinds of corals, which is already unbelievable, but they've incorporated their life cycle into it. They need those corals to be there so that they can rear their young, can grow their eggs. And again, fish do it, sharks do it, octopus do it, even worms do it. That's just a microscope picture of the egg itself. You can see wrapped in a protective coating. Now, as great as all these adaptations are, and it's fantastic ecosystems and life down there, there are threats to these ecosystems. And quickly, I'll go through them. That we have ocean warming. It's already happening in the Atlantic. If you look at the bottom left picture, those are an outcome of one of the models we have that shows clearly that the North Atlantic, right in this area of the canyons, is heating up 3 to 5 times faster than anywhere in the Atlantic. And so that's a problem because corals, most of them can't get warm. They don't like it at all. They will be like plants that you don't water. They'll just wilt and they will die. In fact, when we get near 57 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius, we start to lose corals, and some drop off dramatically. And so that's a real concern that's happening. We've already seen the loss of lobsters in Connecticut. They've all migrated north into cooler waters, and we may see, will the corals move? Will they move in advance to canyons and go north in the canyons? We don't really know. Acidification is a real problem. These are calcium carbonate skeletons that these corals lay down, and they do it so slowly, like I told you, that if you acidify the ocean with all the CO2 that's going in, it's going to dissolve that skeleton faster than it can make it. So they won't be able to grow at all, and we'll lose the corals. and that's pretty serious. The extractive industries of fishing activity, and as you can see here, oil and gas extraction is a picture of the Deepwater Horizon, which had a large impact on deepwater corals. You look at the picture on the right, instead of a nice healthy colony of coral there with brittle stars on it, it's dead and anemic. The ophiuroids or brittle stars are anemic on there. Really, we found several patches of that in the Deepwater Horizon. We didn't know before 2010 when that happened that we could have oil and gas spills be a problem for corals. That wasn't even a considered threat then. But fishing activities has long been considered a threat because of how long it takes these corals to grow back. So in the far right picture on the bottom, you see a trawl off of Australia. That's all hard bottom coral or hard coral in that net. Could represent thousands of years of growth gone in an afternoon from trawling. So that's a serious issue. And then marine debris is also serious. During our cruise with Buck, we found a large trash bag wrapped around, a plastic bag wrapped around a coral. The coral then can't feed, right? The polyps can't get the nutrients, and so it'll die. And so that's a serious issue. Of the 40 canyons that we've surveyed so far to date, every canyon off our coast has trash in it. There's a lot of fishing gear. That's number one. Nets, line, traps, all those are there. Plastics is number two. There's also metal. There's also woods. I've seen jet engines on the seafloor, toilets, and things off of ships, I think mostly. But some of that comes down even from land. So marine debris is a real issue. So with all these threats that are facing the corals that we really are just starting to learn about and study, we have something that's so valuable as the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts National Monument. That's so important to have this natural laboratory for us, that we can go and look how these things change. Those threats I mentioned are not just threats, they're actually opportunities. We can go out and look how the temperature changes now. We can monitor that and see how corals communities change. Do the animals living on them jump off when it gets too hot, or when they start dying, the corals, when do the animals come off? How much diversity will we lose? And we can look at oil and gas extraction, how that impacts the coral communities as well, and do that in conjunction with those who do those practices, along with fishing. So we could look at the impacts of wire and traps on the seafloor to see what colonizes them. So I don't see those threats as all threats. The threats are the corals, but we can use them as challenges and opportunities to learn more. I think that's the value of this monument, which is so important for us. And I just want to end here. I know I'm probably running over, but here are the 3 canyons again from the monument and the numbers of coral species we currently know about. And that's 15, 13, and 21. These have been rarely studied. We have in Gilbert Canyon, the middle one, we've never had a submarine in there. We've never had a remotely operated vehicle or robot in there. We just had a towed camera. In Ladonia, there were a couple of submarine dives in 1980, 82. Most of that data doesn't exist. The navigation wasn't there. There's no video, so we don't really know much about what was there except what was collected, which a lot of that is dissolved in museums now. And so what we did with OceanX, who I'm so grateful for going into Ladonia Canyon and having those 3 dives that Buck talked about, we were there. We had 3 dives at different depths. We looked and we saw markedly different species at different depths, which was amazing. Zonation of corals that were so prominent. We only covered 400 feet of seafloor when I went back and looked, which means we found so much stuff when we landed. We didn't even move. We wanted to go explore and look, right? But with that wall that Buck showed was fantastic. We stayed there for I don't know how long, just looking and collecting. But of the 9 coral samples we got, 3 were new species during that period. I mean, that's a remarkable discovery rate of new species. It goes as just testimony to how we really don't know what's down there and how it works. So anyway, there's another picture of it. I've over my time, but I'm happy to take any questions in chat. Thank you so much. So I don't know if somebody moderates now or if we're going to just field questions. I will stop sharing.
Yeah, I'm just looking through comments to see if we get any questions, but our colleagues at OceanX and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute have been providing really great resources the whole time. So yeah, it looks like they've gotten to everything for us if you guys just want to wrap it up.
I actually have a question for you guys, if you don't mind. because you guys spend so much time in the submersible, I'm wondering how protected from sound you are, if you can hear anything when you're under the water. Like I'm imagining that maybe you can hear feeding clicks from whales while you're down there. I'm hoping, but maybe not.
Through the acrylic, we can't hear anything except the loudest noises. And the only time I've ever heard anything, it was when we were in Antarctica, and you could hear the glaciers carving and icebergs bumping into each other. But apart from that, nothing. However, we do have our acoustics, our underwater telephone that operates on about 8 kilohertz. And so we can pick up whales and dolphins. So we do definitely hear clicking and songs. We can also fit a transducer outside just to pick up any noise. But we do have to be quiet because when we're thrusting and driving around, the actual motors make a lot of noise. So if we want to record something, we'll just stop, drift, or go and sit on the bottom quietly somewhere. But yeah, we can for sure. And if there are dolphins in the area, you can hear them singing away, and yeah, it's nice to hear.
So Orla, I have a question because I think about the transfer of organic material, from deep sea up to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And, there are linkages there clearly that we can draw on a piece of paper. But I guess I'm wondering if you have thought about. I mean, I think the deepest diving of any animal has been in the canyons. I think it may have been Ladonia Canyon. So I don't know if you thought about the transfer of carbon that way and how whales bring it down, and upwelling brings it up.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And there's a lot of research that points to whales being what we call ocean farmers. So I have a lot of great photos of whales at the surface just with plumes of poop coming out of their back, So the Cuvier's beaked whales, for instance, again, are going down to almost 2 miles deep. And then they might come up to the surface and transfer all those nutrients as they defecate at the surface. And then you're getting that from many different zones. So how you talked about having the different zones and finding different coral, we have the same kind of niche specialization with cetaceans. So the beaked whales are going to be at the very bottom of the limits of mammals. And then you have the Risso's dolphins, maybe near the surface at 1,500 feet. Something like a pilot whale is just below that, 1,500 to 3,000 feet deep. And all of those animals are just transferring all these nutrients as they go up and down the water column. So it is a really important ecosystem service, although it's funny to think of it that way.
Yeah, I think one of the amazing things I've seen before in where I've gone into sedimented areas about over a mile down, it looks like we see beak marks that are into the sediment as if they're going in to feed on something on the sediment. I've seen it in the Gulf of Mexico, and I didn't know if we think they're feeding, right? I don't know how they would see what, or we don't see marks along the seafloor where they're searching. You think you might see a dig out or something, a trough where they have been on the bottom, but it looks like they come in, like an arrow and from the water column and go bam. And I didn't know if they were trying to get things off the beak, if they have parasites or things, or are they trying scraping it, or are they trying to? I mean, who knows, right? But I'm just curious. These things are often just several feet deep, maybe a couple feet wide, and it looks like they augured into the seafloor and then came right back out the same way.
Wow.
Amazing. I don't know.
That's really interesting. And, I don't know about that specifically, but, bottlenose dolphins, for instance, when they echolocate, what they're looking for is the bounce back of a swim bladder. So they're able to hone in specifically on where a fish or another prey source is underneath the sand without having any visual cues. So they really could just go right in and get it and come back out and not really have to search around for it.
Wow. That's really cool. Didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's great. Wow. That's amazing.
All right. Well.
Aw.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Great to meet you two as well.
Thanks, Buck.
Yeah. Cheers.
It was fun.
Looking forward to seeing both of you on board someday.
Yeah.
Absolutely.